Okay, so what we're going to start off with is we're going to build a virtual machine. That virtual machine is going to be attached, obviously, to a storage account. It's also going to be attached to a virtual network. So here's the virtual network, and it's going to be in a particular subnet on that virtual network. So let's imagine that this is the subnet that it's on. Subnet. Okay, so that's the subnet, the virtual network, the subnet, and the storage account. We're going to put this into an availability set. So here is an availability set. We'll call it AV set, availability set. And then we'll create another virtual machine. It will use the same storage account for storing the VHD files. So there'll be a couple of VHD files in here for each of the C drives of those machines. And we will attach this to the same subnet in the same virtual network. So this can be, let's just say, VM0. This can be VM1. Okay, so that's the basics of it all, but then one of the things we want to do is we want to get this connected to the internet. So let's draw the internet in here. Here's the internet. And I'd like this to be a load balanced system so that we've got a web server. We'll install IIS onto each of these VMs. And how are we going to do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to have a public IP address, which kind of is an address that sticks out into the public internet. And we're going to directly attach that to the network card. Let's draw the network card in here, look. That's the NIC, network interface card. So this thing out here is going to be a public IP. And the way that public IP works is that it allows all traffic from the all ports, all protocols, all IP addresses to come from the public internet and to hit that VM. So one of the things that we'll use here is we'll use RDP. So I'm going to use RDP, I'm going to connect to the VM, I'm going to install IIS, I'm going to make a modification to the home page so you can see it's coming from VM0. I'll do exactly the same thing with another one. So let's create another network card. Another NIC here, and we'll connect this up to a public IP, and we'll RDP into that one as well, just using the public IP. RDP runs over port 3389, and we'll just go straight in on port 3389 at the IP address for that machine. Okay, and the next thing we want to do is we want to load balance between these two web servers. So the way we'll do that is we'll create another public IP address, and we'll attach that public IP address to a load balancer. Here's a load balancer, and the load balancer sees this front-end IP address as what's called a front-end IP pool, or front-end pool. And we'll also have a pool of addresses here, which is known as the back-end pool. And we'll attach these networks cards to that back-end pool, and we'll attach the load balancer to it. And the advantage of this is that it allows us to load balance across the systems. So, for example, if I have a user using a computer and they send an HTTP request into this public IP address, well, that public IP address is associated with the load balancer, which is associated with a back-end pool, which is associated with a network card, which is associated with a VM, and that is associated with IIS running on that VM. And that will then obviously respond with a web page, and the whole thing will work out in reverse and will deliver the page to the user. Now, the kind of fortunate / unfortunate thing that happens is TCP connections are held for about 4 minutes in this situation. But if we were to wait more than 4 minutes, so we'll wait 5 minutes and see what happens. Then we should be able to see something like the next HTTP request coming in, hitting the IP address, going onto the load balancer, and then it being routed to ideally a different VM, meaning that the page will be returned from a different version of IIS. So as long as I've got, you know, something on this IIS server that says this is VM 0, and I've got something on this IIS server that says this is VM 1, I'll be able to tell which one is returning the page. So what color was I in there? I was in that sort of dark blue color. So this IIS server will return a page that says this is VM 1. So that's what we're going to build. So let's create a new page here. Let's start first of all with the basics. So we'll start with a VM, and we will put that VM into a storage account that we'll create as part of creating the VM. So the VHD for that VM will be there, and we'll also create the network. So let's do that first of all. Just got to faff around to make my make this work for me now. Whoops, sorry, bear with me. Right, so we're going to go to the portal. That's not working. There we go. Right, let me minimize this down. Let's go to the portal. This is the portal, and we'll go to virtual machines, and we'll add a new virtual machine. You can see I've got a bunch here that I've already been playing with, and I'm going to search for images which include Visual Studio 2015, simply because nearly always when I have a virtual machine, I always wish I had Visual Studio on it once I've been running it for a little while. By the time you do this, this might say SDK 2.9. That was released a couple of days ago, but it hasn't been updated in this portal yet. So we'll do Visual Studio Community Edition. That's the free edition with the Azure SDK. And it says use the Resource Manager to create it. So that's how we'll create it, using Resource Manager, which is used by ARM templates, for example. And we'll put some basics in here. So this machine can be called VM0. The username is Planky. The password is something I'm not going to tell you. I specify the subscription, and then I'm going to create a new resource group, and I'm going to call this one vid test planky-rg. Vid test planky-rg for resource group. I'm going to put it into North Europe and say OK to that. North Europe is the Dublin region, which has got a bunch of data centers there which make up that region. Okay, now you can run Visual Studio on a 2-core 7 gig machine, so I'll do that. I'll go for that and say select. And now I come to the settings. So, got a few things to think about here now. I'm going to go for a premium SSD because whenever I'm using Visual Studio, I need performance, and so that's important. The storage account, it creates one for me. I don't like the name format for that, so I'm going to give that a different name. So let's go up here. So rather than creating a new one, let's just rename the one that's already here. So let's call it vidtest planky store for storage. That makes sense, doesn't it? So it's going to be called vidtestplankystore.core.windows.net. If I move off that, we should see a little green arrow appear just here, which it did, and I can say OK to that. So I've got my storage account. The next thing I need is a virtual network. It's created a virtual network for me, but I don't really like the name of it. So let's go and deal with that. So rather than creating a new one, I will change the name of the one that's already here. So I'm going to call this vidtestplankynet. And you can see here the address space is 10.2.0.0/16, so the address space is basically 10.2. There will be subnets within that. There'll be a default subnet, and the range of that one is 10.2.0.0/16. 10.24. So the first 24 bits there, those first 24 bits there will determine which subnet we're in, and the last 8 bits will tell us which node within the subnet we are. But that's just called default, that default subnet, so we'll stick with that. That looks absolutely fine. I know it will work. Say OK to that. So now I've got a virtual network which has got a good name, vidtest planky net. It's using the default subnet, so it's on 10.2.0.0/24, so it's in the 10.2.0 subnet. It's going to create for me a public IP address for VM0. Do you remember, this is the one that was directly connected to the VM, not via the load balancer. So this is the one that I can use to RDP into the machine and configure it. So what should we do here? Let's have a look. Rather than calling it VM0, let's call it VM0 public IP, VM0 pip. There's two types of assignments. There's dynamic, which means that if I delete that VM, or if I stop the VM, stop deallocate or delete that VM, then I will lose the IP address. If I leave it as, if I put it as static, then when I recreate that machine, it will get its IP address back again. So it's a way for me to reserve the IP address. If you look at the pricing page, you'll see that reserving an IP address, having a static IP address, one that doesn't change no matter what you do to the underlying system, that's £2 per month. That's probably about $3 per month to do that. Okay, so let's stick with that. Hello, did I click it? I did click it, yeah, okay. So what have we next got? We've got a network security group here. Now this network security group will say, I'll show you what it says. So they've called it VM0, but I think it should be called VM0 NSG. And this one allows, look at this, look, the inbound rules, it allows anything to go to port, it's an inbound rule that allows anything to go to port 3389, which is the RDP port. So any IP addresses, any ports, any clients from anywhere. So anybody can get into RDP as long as they know the username and password of the machine. I don't have any outbound rules. So that's fine, that will work. So let's stick with that. And then normally it would say, let me just have a look, make sure this is all going into the right resource group. Yeah, it's not asking me about which resource group it's in, but we can live with that. I suppose it makes sense because the network security group is attached to the virtual network, which is in the same resource group. Okay, so I've got monitoring, I've enabled monitoring. Diagnostic storage account. So diagnostic information is put into a storage account. I don't think that's a very nice name for it, so let's go and rename that. And I'm going to rename that to vidtest planky diag for diagnostics. So, okay. Okay, then we've got this important thing here, which is the availability set. We need to create a new availability set. That's the thing which ensures that the machines are spread across different fault domains. So we'll create a new one here. And I'm obviously going to call it vidtest planky availability set, AV set. And we've gone for the default, which is 5 update domains. You can have up to 20 update domains. I don't think we really need that for such a simple solution. And I've gone for 3 fault domains. Actually, what you'll see is that's the maximum number you can have, go up to a maximum of 3 fault domains. Okay, so we'll say OK to that. And then we've got everything set up, so we should now just click OK. Say OK again. And now that is provisioning. You can see it says the deployment has started. At this point, I'm going to pause the recording because we'll be here waiting for probably 10 minutes, well, maybe 8 minutes, for all of these different things that I've just gone through to actually deploy. So let's see what happens. Next time you hear me, it will be 10 minutes later or thereabouts. So I've just changed the display back to the VM. According to the notifications button, it says, oh, the deployment to that resource group has now been successful, so everything should be working now. So in theory I could connect to that machine. Let's do that, shall we? Let's connect. Open. Don't ask for any of these things again. And the account I used was Planky. And as I said before, I'm not going to tell you the password. There we go. So now I'm on the actual VM. It's going to take a little while for things to sort of settle down when it builds it the very first ever desktop, but I think it should be along quite quickly, so let's just be patient and wait for that. Here we go. So I think Server Manager normally starts up first in any case, so let's fire that up ourselves and let's go through the process of installing IIS. I've got to wait for this blue bar up here to finish. I think it's done it. Yeah. So I'm going to install Internet Information Services, the web server for Windows. Come down here, web server, add these features, next, 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 install. So it's going to go through the process of installing that. That takes about 3 or 4 minutes. While I'm here, I'm just going to go into this section here and get Server Manager to stop firing up, and I think that'll do. Okay, so now we need another VM. Let's go back to our little diagram here. So I'm going to redraw that. Let's start again from scratch because it looks a bit ugly. So what we've done is we've got, let's make sure I've got everything right here. We've got our VM. We know it's called VM0. It's got IIS installing on it at the moment. It's attached to a storage account, to a specific VHD file which is forming the C drive. We know that it's inside an availability set called AV set. We also know that it's attached to a virtual network, so it's got a connection coming down here to a virtual network, and that virtual network, I think I called that vid test planky net, didn't I? Did we do anything else? Oh yes, there's a public IP address that goes all the way out to public, and there is an NSG associated with that, and it allows anything to go to RDP, which is port 3389. So anything on the internet can get to port 3389. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create another VM here. That'll be VM1. We'll put IIS onto that as well. We'll store its drive in the storage account. We'll also attach that to the subnet, to the virtual network, and that's going to go onto, let's have brown, onto the subnet, which I don't know if you noticed, it was called default. So let's do that next. Okay, so I go to virtual machines, I say add, I look for, like I said earlier, I always like to have Visual Studio on the machines because invariably it's something that you end up needing anyway, so I might as well get it on there to start with. So it searches through the marketplace, finds me the Visual Studio community with SDK 2.8, create using Resource Manager. Okay, so we're getting to doing the settings now. So this is going to be VM1, isn't it? Remember that? VM1. The username for the administrative account is Planky. The password is that special string I'm not going to tell you. Then the resource group. I'm going to select an existing resource group this time because I want it to go into the same resource group as where the other VM is, and that was called vid test planky RG, that one there. And that's going to be in North Europe, so I'll say OK to that. and everything is okay. Next I'm going to get a virtual machine, so we'll go for that size, same as before. And then finally we're going to configure all these optional features. So I will go for Premium SSD, and look, it does some nice stuff for me now. It makes some assumptions. So VidTest Planky Store, that's already set. VidTest Planky Net, that's already set. The default subnet is already set. The public IP address, it's called it VM1, and remember I don't like that name, so I'm going to call this VM1 pip. See, up in this bit up here that you can see. It's a dynamically assigned public IP address, and I say OK. So that means that the public on the public internet can connect to that. There's this network security group here. It's called VM1. I don't like the name of that, so I'm going to call it VM1 NSG. VM1 NSG, and that is going to allow anything on the internet to connect to port 3389 over TCP, which will allow somebody to do RDP, remote desktop. Say OK to that. Let's make sure we've got everything. So we've got our network security group, we've got monitoring switched on, we've got our, look, it's picked up the VidTest Planky Diag account again, so that's really good, isn't it? And we need to specify the same availability set. So there it is, look, VidTest Planky AV set. Let's select that one. So all of that is now set, and say OK to it. And then we say OK, and then finally create. So while that's happening, if I show you up here, look, it says deployment started. Should be a bit quicker this time because the storage account, the two storage accounts, one for diagnostics, one for the VMs, the virtual network, the NSG, lots of things have already been set for it. So it should be a little bit quicker to do. Okay, so I'm just going to go on. In fact, no, I'm going to go to the diagram here and say there was something that we missed in that little diagram there, and that was the public IP address. So let me change the colour of that. How do I do Control Z? Let's do it again. Here's the public IP address on the public internet, and there will be an NSG associated with this, and it will allow everything to go to RDP on port 3389. Okay, so that's what's being built right now. Let's just wait for that to happen. Let's go back and have a little look at how it's doing. Deployment started. I'm going to pause the recording for a little while because you know, it just takes a little while for this to happen. Let's get this back to the default view. Don't need any of this anymore. In fact, what I could do is just go into resource groups and show you. There's my resource group, and we should be able to see the resources in that now. So that's not the resource group. Sorry, it's that one there, isn't it? So you can see there's the availability set. You can see VM0. Ooh, that's a bit odd. Look at that. Look, I did VM0 in uppercase and I did VM1 in lowercase, but never mind. Let's get rid of all this. Let me stop this from showing. Stop that from showing. You can see here I've got two network cards. They will be associated to those two VMs. I've got the VM0 NSG and the VM1 NSG. I must have been on uppercase when I did that first lot. And I've got the PIP, the public IP address for VM0, and the public IP address for VM1. So those are the resources that are in that group. And yeah, we're just waiting for them to provision. So let's just pause the recording for a little while and come back to it. Okay, so I think that's finished now because the thing up here doesn't even show deployment succeeded. Look, right. So okay, let's now go. Let's connect to that VM, shall we? So we go VM1. The connect option isn't. Oh, yes, it is. I was going to say it's grayed out, but it's not. So I'll open this. Connect to it. So it's /Planky and the password. Say no to that. Fire Server Manager up. Have to wait for this blue line to stop taking inventory. Looks like it stopped, so I can now add roles and features. Skip this page. And we'll add the web server. Features, next, install. Okay, so that's going to take a few minutes to install. Let's go back to the previous machine that I created, down here somewhere, VM0, there it is. That's now installed IIS. So let's now go to the page where, let's go to the files in the www root directory, and let's edit this document here, and let's call it, any thicker brushes than that? Well, that's pretty thick, isn't it? Right. VM0. So that's VM0. Save that. Now let's minimize, well, let's just prove that that works. We'll go to localhost and prove that it gives us that. There we go. Okay, so that same page should be delivered over the new public IP address that we will create soon. And then if we come down here and go to the first one again, VM1, that one has now also installed. So let's go to that same location, edit it. And this time we'll do that thick brush there, and we'll say the one this time. Save that. Looks a bit like graffiti, doesn't it? But that kind of makes it arty, doesn't it? Should probably log off this, but I can't be bothered really. Oh well. Maybe when I go like, oops, maybe when I go like that, I could do a log off. I don't need to go back onto the machine anymore. Right, okay, so let's go back to our little diagram here. Have we got all of that? Yes, we've got all of that in place, and we've actually got IIS installed onto the individual VMs as well. So let's draw that in purple, shall we? So we've got IIS in there, and IIS in there as well. Okay, next thing to do then is to create a new load balancer. So we're going to create a load balancer out here. Sorry, we're going to create a public IP address out here, and we're going to connect that to a load balancer, and we're going to connect that load balancer to a back-end pool. As far as the load balancer is concerned, this public IP address is called a front-end pool, and we'll also set up within the load balancer a rule to take the traffic from there and pass it through to this back end. So let's have a go at doing that next. Let's minimize that. So I need to go back to my resource groups. In fact, I don't need that. I need to go to Browse and find public IP addresses. Public IP addresses. There we go. Okay, so these are the various public IP addresses I've already got. We can see VM0 pip and VM1 pip, the ones that we used to connect over RDP to the existing machines that you're running. I'm now going to create this brand new IP address or public IP address. So I'm going to call this, was it vid test planky? Was it planky vid test or vid test planky? I can't remember what I was calling things. Let me just go back and make sure I've got the names right. Vid test planky. So I go browse, go to the public IP address, public IP addresses, and I will call this one vid test planky pip. That makes sense, doesn't it? Sorry, I've got to add. So, and I will call it vid test planky pip. I'll use a dynamic IP address. I could use static, but I'll just use dynamic. The idle timeout is 4 minutes by default. If we just look at this, look, it says it's how long will it keep the TCP or the HTTP connection open without relying on clients to send messages, which will, from the client end, keep the connection alive. So by default, that's 4 minutes. I need a name here, so I will call this vid test planky, and the name of that, when I move off it now, we'll see this should come green. Yeah, so it's going to be called vidtestplanky.northeurope.cloudapp.azure.com. That will be the DNS name of this public IP address. Okay, I want this to go into my resource group, so I will don't want a new resource group, I want my existing resource group. So come down to vidtestplanky-rg for resource group, do you remember that? And I put it in North Europe. So all of that is stuff to do with that pip, and again we have to wait for that to complete, because we won't be able to associate a load balancer with a pip until the pip has actually been created. Let's come up here and have a look. I am recording this, aren't I? Yes, I am. I'm using Camtasia, as you can see, to do it. What does that say? Does that say it succeeded? So that's now succeeded. The deployment into that resource group was successful. I think if I push these buttons here, it tells me what it did. Yeah, all right. Okay, I think I'll ignore that. Okay. So the next thing we need is a load balancer. Well, we could go and have a look at that. Let's go and have a look at that pip that I created. Public IP addresses. Vid test planky pip. And it's got some settings over here. Look, audit logs, new support request, properties. Let's have a look at those. Gives us the DNS name. It doesn't say, you can see it says associated to, and that's blank at the moment because I'm going to associate it to either a network card or a back-end address pool, which will be associated with a load balancer. It's got other information here. Let's have a look at the configuration. So it says I'm going to get a dynamic IP address, I'm going to have a 4-minute timeout, and that's my DNS name. Okay, so next thing to do then, let's close these down. If I go from there, it should close all the blades down. Close that one down as well. If I now go to browse and I go to load balancer, load balancers, there we are. Then you can see I've got a couple of them created already, but I'm going to add a new one. And this one's going to be called vid test planky LB. it's going to be, you can have two types of load balancers, ones which are used internally inside the virtual network, and ones which are connected to the public internet, connected to PIPs. So this one's going to be a public one, and the public IP address, I need to pick one of the public IP addresses that I already have, and we know is the reason that one's highlighted is because that one is in the same resource group as I'm creating the as I'm doing everything else. It's also not already associated. So I've picked that one. It's going to use that subscription. I'm going to specify the resource group now. So if I come in here and pick vid test planky RG for the resource group, and I say create on that one, and then minimize that, we can see the deployment has started. I'm going to wait for that to now finish. The load balancer takes a bit longer. Oh, that was really quick. It normally takes about a minute. It takes slightly longer than the pip to create. So let's go back to my resource group, and let's have a look. Vid test planky RG. What have we got in here now? We've got our availability set. It's got two VMs in it, VM0 and VM1. We've got our load balancer. That is associated with this public IP address. We've got two network cards for each of those VMs, and we've got two network security groups. I think those network security groups are actually associated with these network cards. We can prove that by having a look at them. Security rules, one inbound rule. Let's have a look at the inbound security rules. Oh, this is, yeah, it's the pips for the allowing RDP into the RDP protocol into the machines. Okay, so where was I? Vid test planky. Still waiting for that to provision actually. So let's get back to our default look. That's all succeeded. So now if I go back to the resource groups, find my, where's it gone? Vid test planky resource group. Let's find the load balancer in there. That one there, vid test planky load balancer, vid test planky LB. Okay, so let's go down through these things now. So we've got some properties, and the properties are the load balancing scheme is public. That's the resource ID. It's going to be in North Europe, so using that subscription name and that subscription ID. Then I need some load balancing rules. Now I think I need to create probe before I can create a load balancing rule. It'll give me an error if I don't do that. So I'm going to create a probe first of all. And a probe is something which just goes ahead and probes the load balancer every so many minutes and determines whether it's alive or not. So I will call this one vid test planky probe. I'll just do this as a TCP on port 80 with a 5-minute interval, and if I get two unhealthy thresholds, that will be deemed to be a failure of the probe. Okay, so that should be enough for that. That's going to take a little while, and we'll see that probe will appear here when it's been provisioned. Oh, it says it's successfully created, so I probably need to refresh that because it hasn't appeared there yet. Let me close that down, go back in again. It's still not there, no. Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, that is the probe. Ah, there we go. Probe, TCP, port 80. Great. Next thing is, let's go to IP address, because I think that has associated the correct machine. Yeah, so it says, look, it says so what it says is this load balancer is associated with a public IP address called vid test planky pip. So that actually says unassigned at the moment, so let's just go in and make sure that it is assigned. Vid test planky pip. I think it says unassigned there. Not really sure what that's about. We'll come back to that. Right, so now I go to my load balancing rules, and I can add a rule, and I will call this one, oh, back-end pool must exist before you can create a rule, so good error. Let's go back. Back-end pool here. Remember, the front-end pool is the pip, and the back-end pool is something that we need to create. So we just give it a name, and we'll call this vid test planky back end pool. Quite a long name. And then I can add virtual machines to this pool. In fact, I think it gives me the option to add an availability set. So look, I choose the availability set, and then it will show me all the VMs within that availability set. So let's go to the availability set. There's my vid test planky AV set, you know, the one that I created earlier. So I'll do that, and now I can choose which virtual machines in that availability set I want to assign to this pool. So I will choose that one and select it, and I'll do it again, and then I select that one and select it. So now I've got my availability set with both VMs, and they are both assigned. Well, when I click OK here, they are both now assigned to this back-end pool. So I've got a back-end pool here added onto this load balancer, and I say OK to that. Now it's updating the. It actually updates the network interfaces. So the UI shows it as VMs, but it's actually the network cards on those VMs that are added to the pool, because those are the things obviously that have IP addresses. Okay, so that looks like that's completed. Let's go back here. So now I can do my load balancing rules, I think. So I add a load balancing rule. So I'll call this one HTTP. So I'm going to allow TCP on port 80. So allow TCP on port 80 to go to the back end, port 80 of the back end pool called vid test planky back end pool. I'm going to specify that probe, the thing which probes every 5 minutes. And then now the way that the load balancer works is you can say don't have any session persistence. So when a client connects to the load balancer will connect them to, say, let's just say VM0. And if you say there's no persistence, then you know there's a chance that it might connect you back to that same VM, but there's a chance that it might not connect you back to the same VM. The next thing you can do is you can specify client IP. So what it says is all clients that come from this IP address will always be bound to this particular VM. So you get a little bit of stickiness there. The next thing you could do is you can say the client IP and the protocol. So if they're coming in over HTTP, let's imagine you've got a client coming in at a specific IP address, or a destination, sorry, coming in with a specific source IP address. You might connect them HTTP always to VM0, but if they come in with the same IP address but a different protocol, let's just say SMTP, mad example, but RDP maybe, then you could connect them to bad example, another bad example, because you would never load balance RDP. That would be a mad thing to do. Let's take FTP. Let's imagine you've got an FTP server on there, they're coming in over FTP, and you might then bind them to a different VM, like VM1 for example. So I'm just going to go for none here, because I prefer to try and see it working. It's difficult to see it working, but I'll see if it's working. And then we disable direct server return, just as we did in the old system. And I think we're near enough done. So let's just go down here and check that we've got everything set. So we've got our properties, just tells us what the properties of this load balancing scheme are. I've got the rules, and the rules allow me to load balance HTTP on port 80 to the back-end pool on port 80. I've got my probe set up. I'm pretty sure I did that already. Yep, vid test planky probe. The IP address is the public IP address that we've created. The backend pool is vid-testplanky backend pool, and if we go into that backend pool, we can see I've got two VMs. In fact, I've got two network cards. This is the network interfaces that are actually connected, not the VMs, although it's easier to think of them as VMs. Just get rid of that. I've accidentally clicked it. Get rid of that. So inbound NAT rules, I don't have any. I don't need them because, let's go back to our diagram. I've got a connection here. Do it in brown. I've got a connection here, which gets me straight into that VM. So I don't need to do any network address translation and translate, for example, port 50,001 to port 3389 on that machine through this connection here. I don't need to do that. Okay, let's get rid of that. Monitoring, diagnostics, I'm not really all that bothered about that at this stage. Okay, so that's my load balancer. I think that's set up correctly. Now the next thing is the network cards themselves will normally have network security groups on them. Let's have a look. We go into settings, we can see network security group there. But let's just have a look. Let's go through these properties here. So we'll have a look at the properties of this VM. It's attached to VM0. Look, the IP address is actually a MAC address there. It's attached to that which we know is attached to the load balancer through the pool, resource location, subscription names, etc. If I look at the IP addresses, we know that this should say the back-end pool, shouldn't it? VM0 pip, private IP address setting. Oh, this is purely the IP address. If I then go to DNS, it'll just say that it's going to be using the default DNS server, the Azure DNS server. And then if I go to the security group, if we look at this network security group, we can see it's got an inbound rule. And if I look at that inbound security rule, it says it will by default allow RDP into my network. Now I want to allow, in fact, it allows any source to any destination, but only over RDP. So what I want to do is I want to add HTTP. So let's call this inbound security rule HTTP. Give it a priority of 1010. It's 10 higher than that. And we'll say we'll allow anything from the source on any protocol, on the source port range of any port, to a destination of anything on a destination port range of 80, and we'll allow that to happen. So we'll allow that, and we've got to wait for that to be completed. So let me just show you in our little diagram here. That is a network security group, so let's try and draw this in. We've got just here, why is that not working? My pen has just decided to stop working, which is a bit irritating. Oh, why is the pen not working? Let me try and do this with a mouse. We've got just here, can't see the mouse. Just here on VM1 there's a network interface, and just here on VM0 there's a network interface, and that network interface has associated with it an NSG, for which we have just opened up port 80 from any VM, from any IP address. Another one here, an NSG network security group, and we've opened up port 80 on that one as well. Sorry about the writing. If my pen was working, it would look slightly neater. Not much neater, but slightly neater. So that's now been provisioned. So I need to do exactly the same thing for the other network adapter. So that was the inbound security rules That was the network security group for VM0 NSG. So I want VM1 NSG now, don't I? So let's get rid of that. Get rid of that. So now go to this VM, VM1 225. And I go to all of its settings, and I go to network security group, and there I go to VM1 NSG, and I look at the inbound security rules for that, and it says that there's a default allow RDP, but I need to allow HTTP, so I need to add an extra rule which I'll call HTTP. Priority is slightly higher priority. I'm going to allow any source IP address on any protocol, any source port range to any destination on any destination port on port range 80, and the action is to allow. So now it's going to create that security rule again. Okay, it says it's updating. Let's wait for it to complete. So it hasn't actually completed there. So now, in theory, if I now go to the IP address, to the DNS name of that public IP address, which is connected to the load balancer, I should see load balancing working across the two VMs. So what I need to do now is find it. So with test blanking RG, let's go to the public IP address. And you can see here it's got its DNS name, so let's click, let's allow access to that. Let's copy that, and let's open up a new browser and go in there. Paste. So fingers crossed. So we've been routed to VM0. The load balancer has routed us to VM0. If I now go Control F5, it might route us to VM1, but I suspect the fact that we've got slightly sticky sessions means it won't. Let's try. I'll keep trying. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to leave that for 5 minutes and see if it'll route us to a different VM. I know that if I do this on a different machine, it will go to a different VM. It will go to VM1. Or if I just keep doing this often enough, I'll try 50 of them and we'll see what happens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50. Now it didn't quite do that, did it? Let's just leave it for 5 minutes and we'll come back to it. So I'll pause the recording for a few minutes while we do that. Okay, that's 5 minutes. Let's live in hope now. Control F5. Oh no, it didn't do it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Perhaps if I opened up another instance of a browser, maybe the fact that it's coming from the same IP address might not fix that problem. But let's go for an in-private browser. Let's get the name from up here and try again. VM1, marvellous. So we do have a load balancer which is working. What if I Control F5 this one? Does this one? No, that's stuck to VM1. Look. Okay, but you can see that you do have load balancing working there. So isn't that amazing and wonderful? I'm sure your life has been changed as a result of this. The magic of software. Go and do it yourself. Try with it. Now, before I finish off, one thing I do want to talk about is what you don't get with Azure. So, you know, what we've got here is two. Let me redraw this diagram. Let me just. The pen isn't working. That's very irritating. I don't know how I'm going to draw this now. What I was going to say was, why has it done that? I'll stop the recording and add a bit onto the end afterwards. So what you don't get with Azure is anything that takes care of state. Well, certainly in Azure VMs you don't. So, for example, if I draw, this is VM0, and this is VM1, and they're both connected. Essentially, they're both connected to that load balancer. There's a shorthand here, but you know, you've got a load balancer, and that's connected to the internet. Now, if you have a client on the internet, and let's imagine that they're in an e-commerce website, and they go to page 1, and it says that they're in the shopping basket. Shopping basket. And step 1 of the shopping basket says quantity. So they type their quantity, they hit the next button, and that results in an HTTP request being formatted. Let's have it here, look. And then that gets sent across the load balancer and gets routed into one of the VMs, and that's where that HTTP request now lives. Okay, let's now imagine that they go on to number 2, and this says part number. So let's imagine that that creates another HTTP request. Let's have another HTTP request over here, and the person hits next, and that HTTP request goes across, and the load balancer routes it to a different VM. That can happen. I know it didn't happen in our example earlier because of the sort of semi-stickiness that exists in this load balancer, but it can happen. So now what we've got is a VM1 that knows about the quantity of things that you want. It knows the quantity, and we've got VM2 which knows the part number, but we don't have anything which understands the transaction overall. And you can imagine 3 might be the address for delivery, and 4 might be payment options, and all the different things, but each one of them could result in a different HTTP request, and you could essentially end up with each one of these HTTP requests in each of the machines being disconnected from each other. So it's down to it's the responsibility of whoever is developing this application to have something at the back end which is common and can be seen by both systems. So I'm just going to draw a common area here, and let's do all that again. Let me just rub these HTTP requests out on these machines, and let's rub these ones out as well. There's a more efficient way of doing that. I should have just selected it. Let me just get everything back to the way it should be. Fill that VM in. Right. So now what we'll do is we'll do the same thing again. We'll go for number 1 here. Look. We'll generate our HTTP request. We'll then send it. It will go across here. Let's just imagine the load balancer routes it to VM0. And then what VM0 does is it keeps a copy of it in this common database. Then let's imagine that we get number 2. Whoops. We get part 2, which is the part number, so we get our HTTP request, and we pick that up, and it goes across here. And then what VM1 does then is it stores it in here. Now VM0 and VM1 both have a full view of the transaction so far, but let's imagine that we do number 3 next. So here's number 3. We have a new HTTP request. We then pick up that HTTP request. Let's imagine the load balancer passes it over to VM0, and then VM0 will store that into this back-end system here. And then let's imagine that we do number 4, which is, for example, payment details. Okay, so that results in we click next. That results in a new HTTP request which goes on VM1, and that gets pushed here. Now what this means is that at any one stage VM0 can look at this transaction, and it's got a full picture. It's got a full picture of everything that's going on. It also means that VM1 can look at that. Let's do it in green. VM1 can look at this picture here, and it's also got a full picture of what's going on. Okay, now the question is, what is this? Well, that's down to you as somebody who's going to build this system. The sort of things you could use. You could use a database and store this information in a table in the database. You could use a NoSQL database, like for example Azure storage tables. You could imagine each one of these being a row in a table, couldn't you? You could use a cache, like a Redis cache, for example, which will give you lightning fast performance. But you know, each one of these things has its own advantages and disadvantages. I mean, you could use something like storage, and you could just use a blob in storage. If you use something like a page blob, which has you know, you can do random I/O inside the file system. There, that might be quite difficult to do, but you could do that. And then you'd want to have some piece of software which ran on this thing here, and you know, gave you some kind of a provider model for this, and maybe a piece over here which did that. And you know, if you are a developer that does this kind of thing, then you'll be familiar with all of this. But just simply having Azure as the hosting platform and having your VMs load balanced at this end of the scale, you know, this bit, all this bit going out this way, doesn't automatically fix the problem at the back end of what you need in order to make this work. Something to give you consistent transactions, consistent view, you know, state management across the multiple VMs that you have. You still have to do that. So it doesn't fix all your it doesn't magically fix all your coding problems for you, but it certainly does fix the problems of building and deploying the infrastructure, because that's quite complicated to do and takes quite a long time. As you saw, we've done this in less than an hour today. Okay, so that's one thing that you don't get with Azure, and well, you wouldn't get it with any cloud provider, because you'd have to build an application to do that. The next thing I'd like to show you is in the portal. If we go to the resource groups, and we're going to find our resource group, vidtest planky, and we have a look at the settings here. Can you see there's an export template here? So if I click that button, it gives me a view of the template, and I can actually save that template, and I can download it, I can save it, I can even deploy it. So I could go through the process now of deploying this template, which describes everything that we've previously done, but I would deploy it with different names, and you know, I'd have maybe VM3 and VM4 in a separate resource group with a separate network doing something else. So now I would recommend that you watch a video about what resource group templates are about, and if you want to understand all of this stuff here, I'm not going to go into the detail of what all of this means, but there's some common things. So you know, you always have a schema, you always have a content version. Those things always exist at the top of a. This is a JSON file which defines. It's a bit like a configuration file that defines everything. Then you have a section called parameters, and then these are all the different parameters that you have, and you can see them all here. Look, there's the parameters for an availability set for virtual machines VM1, parameters for all the different things have their own sets of parameters. And then a bit further down we have variables. Let's try and find those. Those are actual resources, I think. Let's go back. There's the parameters. We'll find variables in a minute. No, they look like resources to me. Oh, here we go. Variables. So variables follow from this point on. Oh, it says there are no variables. Oh yeah, that says 0 variables. Look, but variables are. I mean, they're called variables, but they quite often hold constants. I know that doesn't make sense, but it kind of does once you get into it. The sort of thing you might do is you might have a parameter which asks you when you deploy your template for the username of a database and the server name of a database, and then what you might do is use the JSON to construct a variable which is the complete connection string that you'll pass to that database. So that's why you have parameters and variables. And the resources themselves are they are the things like the load balancers and the pips and those kinds of things. So if I wanted to download this template, then I just click the download button, and that's not working very well, is it? Why is that? That's hidden behind. Look at that. Isn't that irritating? And then I could just save that in my documents, video edits, exported template, and then I could just open that folder and have a look at that template. So there's the template. This is a zip file. If I just extract that, then you can see I've got the PowerShell script here to deploy it. I've got a shell script to deploy it. I've got the template itself, which is JSON, and then I have a parameters file, and that will help me. You know, I can fill the parameters file in. I'm not going to open it up just because we'll go down a big rat hole. But that's something that you can do. So that's very useful to do. Now I recommend that you watch a video. Let me see if I can find it. It's on channel 9. channel9.msdn.com. We're bound to go to the build conference now, which is running live. But what I want to do is search for
hosting : environment variable. That's what tells ASP.NET Core what environment you're running in. And of course, I'm in VS, so I'm running in development. Okay, so that's where that comes from. It's just an environment variable. But this environment tag helper, it looks at the current environment. If you're running in that current environment, then it renders its content. And it removes itself, like that environment tag disappears. If you're not running in that environment, then it doesn't render its content. Okay? So if I'm running in development, I'm going to get like the full version of these style sheets. I'm going to get the full
it's not the one. No, not that one. Customizing templates. This one here. I actually think it's quite. You don't need to watch version 2 or issue 2 and issue 3 of this. This one is quite good with Chris and Haishi, who explain what Resource Manager is, and then you could have a look at this one, which shows you how to customize those templates. So you could get your own template, export your own template, and then customize it afterwards to do the things that you wanted it to do. You might want to learn how to actually deploy one, and there's another video there which shows that as well. But the ones that I've watched these two here, and I actually understood what they were talking about. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? Right, okay, I hope that's pretty interesting for you, and I hope you can do it yourselves. Have fun. Bye.